Good morning and good afternoon. Good afternoon for most of you, and good morning if you're in Alaska or Hawaii or points west. I'm Mark Winne, and I'm a senior advisor at the Center for a Livable Future. And I'm coming to you today from a sunny Santa Fe, New Mexico. So thank you for joining us. The title of this session is Making the Case for Elected Officials. Obviously, the case in question is the food system. How to make it equitable, sustainable, and accessible to all. The title carries with it a bit of a conundrum for most of us here, I believe, which is why the heck do we have to make a case for something as basic as food, good, healthy food for all? Isn't that one of those truths we hold to be self-evident? Well, the short answer is unfortunately no. My very first conversation with an elected official about municipal food policy was in 1984 with the then mayor of Hartford, Connecticut. Wearing a very uncomfortable suit and tie, one I had actually purchased for the occasion, I made my case for city government to consider the local food system, land for gardens and markets, the total abandonment of the city by supermarkets and ensuing food deserts, the numerous federal food programs that were feeding thousands of city residents, to say nothing of the burgeoning demand at food banks, as an important city concern, if not a normal function of city government, like public safety, planning, economic development, and education. After wasting 10 valuable minutes trying to explain the idea of a food system to him, I realized that my task was all uphill. Not disguising his disdain for my concerns, he told me in no uncertain terms that our homicide rate is out of control. White and middle class residents are fleeing the city every day, and the teachers union is threatening to strike. And you want me to pay attention to something you call the food system? I knew I'd lost the battle, but I was determined to win the war, which happened almost 10 years later when a Yale University sponsored study found that 76% of Hartford's lower income children were hungry, or in the parlance of the day, food insecure. The Hartford Courant's headline announcing this fact took up nearly the entire paper above the fold. Within 6 months, with considerable citizen pressure, the mayor announced the formation of the Hartford Advisory Commission on Food Policy, what is today the second longest continuously operating food policy council in the country, Knoxville, Tennessee being the first. Many battles and many victories ensued, but I always remembered the lessons learned from those early days. Good data, good research, community mobilization, and bad publicity for elected officials will inevitably make the case. As an advocate, I would learn to modify the bad publicity or threat of bad publicity tactic. It would gradually be replaced by, "Oh, Mr. Mayor, what a great idea," followed by many letters of thanks and kudos expressed with varying degrees of sincerity. But fortunately, we've come a long way in making the case for a just and sustainable food system for all. Many cities now have some version of a Department of Food, and upwards of 300 food policy councils now populate cities, counties, tribes, states, and provinces across North America. But the challenge is no less daunting now than it was 4 decades ago. It can be argued rightly that the stakes today are even higher. The waters are rising, the dominant food system is cracking, and the needs of children that Glenn North gave poetic voice to this morning are growing. Making the case and getting City Hall on our side has never been more important. To share some of the best practices and lessons learned for getting elected officials on our side, we are joined today by 4 of the most exceptional practitioners of the art of making the case. I have the privilege of introducing Elisa Muñoz Miller, George Reistad, Beth Low-Smith, and Tali Robbins. I'm going to share their bios with you briefly, just so you get a little better idea of who they are. Elisa Muñoz Miller is Executive Director of the New Orleans, I think I said New Orleans, right? Food Policy Action Council. She's been working in food systems and community organizing for over a decade and works hard to demystify food policy and its impact on communities. Elisa enjoys riding her bike with her family and is currently homeschooling a 4-year-old using carrots and raspberries as learning tools. George Reistad serves as the Business Development Specialist on food systems for the City of Madison. Prior to that, he served in the Mayor's office as the Food Policy Director for 4 years. In his role at the City of Madison, George focuses on creating and continuing programs and policies that increase access to capital and funding opportunities within the food system for city residents. And his experience covers a diverse range of food policy and program areas. He plays major roles in the $15 million Madison Public Market Project, the Healthy Retail Access Program, the Mayors for a Guaranteed Income funded Madison Guaranteed Income Pilot Program, and the Madison Food Policy Council. We are also joined by Beth Low-Smith, who is the Vice President of Policy at the Kansas City Healthy Kids. She's been in that position since 2012, and the Director of the Greater Kansas City Food Policy Coalition, position she's held since 2010. Her 2 decades of policy and advocacy experience also includes serving 3 terms as Missouri State Representative, working as a political organizer for a statewide grassroots coalition, and time also as a domestic violence social worker. Her advocacy efforts have earned awards from the Missouri Bar Association, the Missouri Immigrants' Rights Association, Empower Missouri, and others. As a professional windmill tilter, Beth always has room at her table, though not always room on her plate. And last but not least is Tali Robbins. She is the policy director in the office of Michelle Wu, Boston City Councilor at Large and candidate for the mayor of Boston. She previously worked as an outreach associate in the Food and Environment program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. She has a Master's of Science in Agriculture, Food and Environment from the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University. We're really lucky to have all 4 of you here. I'm very grateful that you could join us and give us your time and your wisdom, and we're looking forward to having a great discussion with you. Just a note on the agenda and the process that we're using. George and Elisa are going to go first. They're going to speak for about 15 minutes, and that's going to be followed by 15 minutes of comments and questions from the attendees, the audience. We want you to participate. We're inclined to want to try to get you on the screen and talking if you're okay doing that. So we'd ask you to raise your hand as opposed to just submitting a question. But if you're more comfortable submitting a question or you want to add some information as a resource, feel free to use the chat box. But we'd like to get you up into the action. Then we'll be joined by Beth and Tali for another 15 minutes, followed again by 15 minutes of discussion, comment, and so forth. And hopefully we'll have a little time left at the end and can continue the discussion. And we're also trying to leave a little bit of time at the end, about 10 minutes or so, for you all to hang out as if this was, really there. We're all there and we can get together and chat and talk and do that stuff, and as best as we can using our virtual apparatus. So without further ado, I'm turning it over to Elisa, and you are going to share with us what you've learned about making the case.
Sure, thank you. Thanks everybody. Elisa Muñoz, and I'm here again from the New Orleans Food Policy Action Council. One correction from my bio, I am no longer homeschooling. He is back in school after COVID and then a hurricane. So now I'm just eating raspberries and carrots, thank goodness. So I thought a lot about what to talk about during this session, because you all are also in food policy, there's a lot going on and you could talk about this and talk about that. And then I realized that for the past 2 years, all we've been talking about in New Orleans and in Louisiana is unfortunately disaster response. We were created in the shadow of Hurricane Katrina. And then, now we are not even in the shadow of COVID. We're fully in COVID. And then we just had another hurricane that hit that displaced all of us. I was out of town for 10 days. My kid was out of school for almost a month. So there's nothing else really that I could focus on talking about. And it's been a long slog in this, but I also think that Louisiana, I don't want to say canary in the coal mine, but I don't want to not say it, with climate change and just with disasters in general. I think we're all going to be in disaster response mode. So that's kind of where I'm going to focus and talk about how we've been making the case for a just and equitable food system, not just when disasters happen. So for us, when a disaster strikes, whatever that may be, whether it was the pandemic kind of shutting everything down or a hurricane, all of those sorts of things that we've had, there's kind of this process that we go through. The first process is emergency freak out. We have to get emergency food happening immediately. We have to get information out to people. We have to figure out how to feed them. And we do that pretty well. We, FEMA comes in, Jose Andres comes in, we kind of get that going. And in a lot of times that's kind of where it stops. Like you do that and then you just sort of go back to where we were. But when you have compounding disasters like we've had, what's the normal that we're going back to? So we are working to make the case for elevating our food system so that when a disaster strikes, we're not going back to the same things. So we're forward thinking as opposed to immediately calling FEMA and then, hoping that fixes it and then go back. So our process for the last few years, unfortunately, has been, like we said, it goes immediately to this kind of panic mode. And then for us, we shift into policy advocacy work. So that's when we shift into, okay, how do we get disaster SNAP? How do we get pandemic EBT? How do we make sure that kids are getting fed from schools and make sure those rules kind of change? And then, so that's talking to state, local, and sometimes our national policymakers to kind of get that rolled out, advocate for it to happen quickly, because as we know, some of these gears run awfully slowly. And then we roll it out. And part of our work in making the case there is to make sure it's done equitably. So that means, for instance, with pandemic EBT, we noticed that the first question that you could go to apply was a social security number, where you're not supposed to have to be a citizen to do that. And a lot of people were being turned away. And then from there, we move into the lingering effects. And this is where it feels like we really have to make the case. Okay, we got people fed today, like they have food, but tomorrow they have still been out of work for this long. Their savings are shot. They may not have electricity. How are we going to keep this moving when the emergency food runs out? And how are we going to make sure that neighborhoods, if they don't have a food pantry anymore, maybe their corner store is somewhere that they can get fresh, healthy food. And we're also making the case that worrying about disasters, our food system plan, we don't need a food system plan and then a disaster response plan. Food system and disaster response and all these systems have to be coordinated, because our normal now seems to be this sort of scramble. And so we're really thinking through how can we make sure that the policies that are moving forward are both forward thinking and reactive. So one thing that we've been working on that's kind of both of those is business permitting. When thinking about like disaster relief, you often don't think about business permitting. But for us, with COVID and the hurricanes, so many restaurants, which are one of our biggest industries and prides, went out of business. And now we have all these great chefs and cooks who have wonderful skills and they need to be able to start a business. How do we make it easier for them? That's something that I think people don't think of immediately, and certainly our policymakers weren't. So just bringing this to their attention, and bringing the fact that if we have farmers who are able to use our sort of blighted land, our flooding issues, so the things that will make our disasters help mitigate them, will be significantly less, because as we know in this room, having green space helps with flooding issues and drainage and that kind of thing. So it's really showing the policymakers that in order to make sure that the next time something happens, we're not back to this, we have to shore up the system. And another thing we do, and I know I'm almost out of time, is we try to record the effects. So we do a lot of data collection during a disaster so that we can show, here's where we were, here's where we've been, and here's what can help. So we are advocating right now for a city-funded food systems coordinator. So someone where instead of all of a sudden we're all in these committees when something happens, there's somebody who already has a finger on the pulse so that we can react quickly and keep our neighborhood food systems stronger so that we can, I thought I had turned that timer down, sorry. So that again, we are both ready, and we're also, the impacts of something won't be as bad. Because again, if in the past 2 years, we've had 4 disasters, then really like, what's our normal anymore? The baseline seems to have shifted. And how do we make sure that the food system is thought of in that, where the infrastructure is thought of, and that sort of thing. Okay, George, I think I took up the perfect amount of time. I'm going to kick it off to you.
Sounds good. Mark, do you just want me to jump right in? Okay, perfect. I'll share my screen here, folks. So full screen. Okay, and folks see my, well, I can't see y'all. So I'm assuming you can see my screen. I'm going to the full screen. Awesome. Okay. So as Mark said, my name is George Reistad. I'm a business development specialist for the city of Madison, focusing on food systems issues. And what I'd like to talk to you all about for making the case to elected officials today is lessons learned from Madison, specifically around food access and economic development. So I'd really like to focus on the creation and growth of a program called the Healthy Retail Access Program. So this was a program, I should note, I started with the city in 2016. So this was created a little over a year before me. The Healthy Retail Access Program started in 2015 with $100,000 in CAP funding to improve food retail access in identified underserved neighborhoods in the city, and it's managed by our Food Policy Council. I'll kind of explain a little more about this, but it's gone through this series of funding ups and downs over the years, going up to 300,000 and coming down to 150, and now in the latest mayoral executive budget going back up to 250, due in part because of some of the growing pains we had with the program in the early years. So one of the things, I took a screenshot of this report here. One of the things that we discovered was that, maybe a year and a half into my tenure, we discovered that the program was really kind of underperforming. It wasn't drawing the applicants we thought it would draw. And so we worked with the American Heart Association and then the Food Trust out of Philly to do a structural evaluation of the program to really try to guide a strategic revamp of the program. And those strategic recommendations really focused on improving our staffing models and giving more time to the program, really ingraining more evaluation elements to the program, streamlining and simplifying our application, and also removing this kind of arbitrary soft $35,000 cap on awards that we would make. Because what we were discovering is that the practitioners and the store owners, the small store owners throughout the store who either wanted to do remodels or start new stores, $35,000 is just nowhere near enough money to be able to do that type of work. And really, it wasn't able to then spur a lot of what I saw as, kind of my vision for the program, which were these larger capital investments from traditional creditors, right? Like HRAP serving as essentially a leveraging tool. And $35,000 just wasn't going to do that. So I'll get into how we made some of those changes. I wanted to show this map because this is really kind of the baseline of how we make funding decisions, or at least geographic funding decisions. This map is kind of an aggregation of data from a project that the city's been working on with the UW for many years, the Neighborhood Indicators Project, which uses census block group data. It also uses information from Info USA and USDA information for low-income, low-access tracts. This is obviously an older map. The new census data just came out, so that's one of the projects on our plate is to update this. But I'll just walk you through the areas of town to show you some of the projects I'll highlight. This is the southwest side of town, Allied Drive, Duns Marsh neighborhood, where Luna's Groceries is located. This is the north side of town in the Sherman neighborhood, where the Madison Oriental Market is located. And this is the northeast side of town off of East Washington Avenue, where the Go grocery store is located. So I took some screenshots here, just kind of it is a chronological progression, I would say, of our big flagship successes. Right, we started with this very modest amount, or somewhat modest amount, $100,000 in the pot for the HRAP program, with this, again, arbitrary $35,000 cap. Found that it wasn't really attracting many applicants to be able to at least do the impactful work that we wanted to see in our community, both to support really a diverse cohort of entrepreneurs and really to support residents in those neighborhoods who wanted access to the food and services of these grocery stores. So first example here, Luna's Groceries in Allied Drive. This was back in 2018, 2019. There was actually a payday loan store that had went out of business in the neighborhood. Maria Maldonado here and her husband, Joe Maldonado, live a couple of blocks away. She is a Dominican woman. He is a Puerto Rican man. She had a lot of experience running grocery stores back in the DR. And so when she came and saw this opportunity, she approached the city, and we got into conversations and negotiations with her. At the end of the day, we were able to make a very large grant to her of almost $158,000, representing about 25% of her total project cost. That allowed her to leverage that gift into other loans, into peer-to-peer crowdsourcing campaigns and big social media campaigns to get donations from the community. And the store has been running now for about 2 years. It opened in early 2019, has shattered sales expectations. I mean, y'all should have seen some of the Facebook comments. Oh, that place is going to get robbed dry. No one's going to ever shop there. Da, 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 da. And it's just been doing amazing, right? I mean, literally like doubling sales projections, becoming a community anchor, holding all like block parties and toy drives and all of these different things. So it's really proven to be an anchor within that community. That then led to the Madison Oriental Market remodel project in 2019 and 2020. $500,000 total project cost on the north side. We gave them the Lee family $150,000. This is Cynthia Lee. She is the store operator. Her parents, Kyle and Chua, own the store, and they work it together as a family. They bought the store a couple of years back, but it had lighting problems, very old equipment really so old that it was causing spoilage issues for the inventory. And so we worked with them to get them a huge bank of coolers and freezers and really upgrade the store, the lighting, the layout, the shelving, all of those things to be able to just offer a much higher quality store to the folks on the north side. And again, same kind of deal. They were able to use that 150 as kind of leverage or collateral to roll that into larger low interest loans and grants to be able to complete the full build out. And we are actually working with both of these operators right now on an evaluation project with University of Wisconsin Extension to be able to actually form a basis of how impactful are our projects so that we can continue to provide a positive narrative on this program, right? Anecdotally, we've heard all good things. Now we're working on more of a technical approach to evaluating how they've actually served the business owners and the communities. So the most recent one here in 2021 is the Go grocery store. This is a new store. The fine gentleman pictured here, Kababa and Jared Kujabi, are Gambian immigrants, and they are in a position where they also have some retail experience and actually purchased a former strip club, Visions, on the northeast side, and are turning it into a grocery store. Their grant situation is a little unique in that they actually use two different city programs, my program, HRAP, and another program out of economic development called the Commercial Ownership Assistance Program, which actually helps people go from tenancy to ownership. So they have equity stakes in these properties. This is the largest project we've worked on, $1.27 million total project cost, and we offered up $330,000, which is about 27% of that cost. That is still kind of going on. They've closed on the building, and I think I've talked to all three of these owners and operators in the last week, so I'm in pretty constant contact with them. So anyway, this is kind of a snapshot of the successes that we've had with this program. And really the reason I touch on all of these things, the main point I want to make is that basically, if you have some type of political support, start something now. It doesn't have to be perfect, right? Like this program definitely was not perfect when we started it. But, again, much praise and love to my predecessors. They started the thing with kind of minimal political support. And we have then been able to transform that into something that is very successful. In a time where there are really austere budgetary and fiscal conditions, right? Programs are getting cut, programs are getting level funding. This program is actually getting funding increases at this point. So we went from 150 to 250 for this next budget year. And actually that's proliferated out through the capital improvement plan for the next 5 years. So we've gone from 150 to 250 for the next 5 years to be able to actually offer evaluation, technical assistance, and larger programmatic grants. So I say all this to say, if you have any kind of political support, 1 or 2 policymakers that support you, push to get the thing started, put some systems in place where you can track and evaluate and figure out, if something's going wrong, what is going wrong and how do we improve that? But the hardest thing is just starting it. And then you work from there to tell, a good story about it and to improve the program. And that's what we've discovered and have been successful with, I would say, in the last couple of years with this program. I think I went a little over time, so I apologize. I will roll back my time and stop sharing here. Oh, Mark, I think you're on mute.
All right, I'm back. George and Lisa, thank you very much. And I want to see if I got a question here from Peter Ruddick. I didn't want to forget cue him up if he'd be willing to actually share his question and comment. But I'd like to follow up quickly with George. It occurs to me that when you focus on economic issues, and their job creation and their contribution to a local economy, that's a good political selling point. Am I right? Or is that part of the reason you chose to go down that path initially?
I would say that a combination of jobs and food access, right, is kind of a slam dunk combination, right? I mean, especially if you already have a somewhat friendly leaning political environment, which I would argue we do in Madison. That is not, I think, the hardest case to sell. I mean, and there's other things that go, community gardens, right? I mean, there's a number of things that are, well, you can maybe argue about community gardens. Sometimes it's controversial, sometimes it's not, depending on where they're at. But, there are certain elements, I think, that you can really kind of push the narrative and the optics of the issue to really appeal to people. Even if you don't necessarily have all of your ducks in a row, or if you've never done it before and it's kind of an unprecedented action, you can just say that on the expected outcomes of the goodwill of the effort, we should be doing this thing. And I think HRAP kind of fits into that bucket.
Yeah, I think we don't probably spend enough time making the economic arguments about investing in the local food system. So I think you're onto a good strategy there in Madison. Peter, can you share your comment with us?
I can, thank you. First, I'm going to apologize for not being on camera. We were talking about intersectionality with non-food issues this morning. I live way out in the country. Rural broadband won't permit me to have voice and photo at the same time.
We're glad you're with us.
And I would like to say that I just got a text from my advocates that the San Bernardino County supervisors at least decided to move forward. And that was probably because we overwhelmed them with supportive comments. They have a lot of fears. A lot of them are unfounded. I don't think they've done very good outreach to the cities. We've been doing it for them. And it has been so important to get local citizens involved. I'm here not only because I want to be at this conference, but because California is a big state and I don't live anywhere near San Bernardino County. So organizing the local advocates to tell the story in a way that's very different from what fearful regulators are saying, from those who would sort of diminish the importance of a homemade food law, has been one of our most important strategies. We talk to the supervisors ourselves, we talk to the press. Telling that story in a way that makes the policy seem important is so very important.
Can you share any of, what kind of messaging you've done that has been effective?
So a big concern in some of the counties, we got forced into a county by county campaign when the state law was amended to let counties opt out. And some people are trying to re-amend it to let cities opt out, which would mean we'd have to do 933 separate campaigns. The cities are nervous about nuisance issues. It started out with counties nervous about, county health departments nervous about food safety issues. But we have done studies that show that these things are not materializing for permitted cooks. And that makes a lot of folks listen. Their fears were never grounded in any studies. It was all in hypothesis. So having those studies and then having them backed up with those cooks who permitted, talking about how the education, the regulation, the inspection has helped them be better cooks and better citizens, and that they are doing this for their neighborhood, has been a really good strategy.
Good. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. Appreciate that.
Pleasure.
Other folks, get your questions in the queue. We'd like to have you part of the conversation. I think I see something here from Liz Gensler. So Liz, you want to go for it?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Just to the point that you were making before, and George, I'm wondering if anybody is doing a particularly good job of making that economic case for local food systems work. I would love to know about it and be able to steal from it, frankly, but to be able to share it with the councils in our Michigan network, because I think it's something that I think a lot of us sort of inherently are turned off by, like making a case all about money. And maybe it's something that we're not naturally inclined to, be going after the data on, cost benefit analysis, that kind of thing. But if anybody is doing that well, I would love to hear about it. I know our legislative consultant has recently boiled things down to us that legislators care about food in mouths and money in wallets. We need to figure out how to talk about the money in wallets bit.
Yeah, I think that's George. You have a comment on that?
Yeah, I don't want to take away from the other 103 people on this Zoom, but to that point, Liz, I don't know, I kind of came to this realization that the money is actually super important. So that's why I went from the food policy director to a business development specialist. I didn't get demoted, if people were wondering. I advocated for that shift. So, just because being able to work with folks in the community to get them capitalized, especially when they were in positions where they were historically undercapitalized or had all these great ideas and technical acumen, but didn't have a good credit score or, whatever the case might be, it enabled them to then make their vision a reality, which in turn, in many cases, has helped serve the larger community. And so to your point, we're more on a track of trying to do the evaluation around kind of the both and impacts, right? The impact, and I guess I'm specifically speaking about HRAP. There's other things that we're involved with, but around HRAP is what is the store actually doing for residents in the community, right? How is it actually serving them? Is it really kind of an anchor institution for them in terms of their food access? And then also for the business owner themselves, is it accomplishing their business goals? And I don't think it's necessarily a dirty term to be able to show those kinds of things. If the city's going to put money into it and put up taxpayer dollars, what benefit is that getting? Both for, again, this very diverse group of entrepreneurs. You saw the pictures of folks that we were serving. They're, first generation immigrants, folks from all over the world. How does it help them? But also, how does it help the community? And I think that just, I don't know, it just really resonates with people. This is one of the, if I could work on this program all day and all night, I would. I love the HRAP program. It's the best part of my job. I don't know if I answered the question, but that's kind of, I found pretty good reception from policymakers when we have these conversations with them.
Thank you. We do know that you're willing to work harder, so we appreciate that. So thank you, George, and thank you, Liz. I wonder if we can get May Patino queued up, and she has a great question here. We'd love to get her in part of the conversation. I'm going to quickly ask Elisa if you you talk about emergency, emergency response versus trying to get them to think about the problems that contribute to the emergency. That's a really rough dichotomy. And do you, it's always like we can always get the policymakers' attention when the emergency or the disaster is taking place, but then there seems to be a short half-life after that. So you obviously been successful in that regard.
Yeah, it's interesting. The more disasters we have, the easier it gets to make that case, unfortunately, because the emergency response stretches longer and longer. For us, policymakers are realizing that this quick emergency response just isn't going to do it for long periods of time. So I think with COVID, especially because we were one of the first cities to get really hard hit, and we've continued to be really hard hit in Louisiana for a long time, the emergency food, as you all know, the funding and everything kind of ebbs and flows. And so, but people were still hungry in the interim. So that's where it got really challenging for them. And when we started to really get some good conversations going about how do we mitigate this so then the next time something like this happens. And then we had a hurricane in another part of the state where we had 10,000 displaced people in New Orleans who were also hungry in addition to COVID. And then immediately after that, we had a hurricane where we were displaced. So it's just become this kind of thing where emergency upon emergency upon emergency means that you just need a new strategy. Your baseline strategy has to change. And I think that unfortunately has really helped. That and just like data. Man, I live for numbers. I live for numbers and for, making stories, not making stories up out of numbers, but telling a story with numbers and really showing like, if we don't do something, it's not going to go away, y'all. It's just going to get worse. So I hope that answered that question. No,
that's good. Thank you. I don't know if we can get May up here or not, but if not, I see a good question from Lisa DeSantis.
May's there. She's ready.
Okay, go for it, May.
Yeah,
Thank you.
no, thank you. Sorry about that. I just muted because I realized it's really loud where I am and all of a sudden cars were going by. So, but hi, yeah, my name is May Patino and I'm the co-coordinator for the California Food Policy Council and the coordinator for the Humboldt Food Policy Council. And a question that we've been kind of coming up here in some of the kind of resilience work that we're doing up in far northern California, we run into this issue where we're very rural. And a lot of the infrastructure and things that we feel that we need, we realize that some of the business models, like for example, maybe a food hub, is never going to be economically profitable in the same way that it might be in a place that has some larger farms and larger areas. But we're really curious to know if there's examples out there of either previous work that's been done or current efforts that really think about the kind of public health benefit of increased access to healthy food, and if there's been any successful campaigns made to local government support for these types of efforts.
Good question. I don't know if Elisa or George have any comment on that, but if people know of such places or studies or sources, maybe you could put it up in the chat box so we could all take a look at it. That might be the best way to go with that. Maybe we have time for just one more question here. If there's anybody else who would like to get up here in the queue.
Lisa had a question too, Mark.
Okay, I'm sorry. Lisa, yes, that's where I was before. Lisa, can you go for it?
Sure, yeah, I'll just repeat what I wrote in the chat because I think that's the best way I can say it. So my question was, how do you measure impact when your baselines are already off? For example, how much food goes to waste is hard to accurately measure. So how do you make that case knowing that you already start kind of skewed?
I think, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Mark.
No, go ahead, Lisa. Go ahead.
I think I understand the question. I just want to make sure I'm hearing it correctly. So how do we kind of make a case when data is either hard to get or the data you get is very kind of limited? For us, we kind of look at larger data sets when we can. So whether that's through the ag census or through, some larger organizations that do something like that. We also do a lot of kind of storytelling on that, or pick like a pilot project actually with food waste is interesting. We're working on that right now because we have this, this huge touristy area called the French Quarter. And then we also have a lot of emergency food, and these produce food waste. So we're working with a few restaurants to record how much food waste they have, so that then we can kind of say, this is what, this average size restaurant does. Now imagine it, more of them. And so that's kind of what we're doing, is trying to get primary data when we can't find good like secondary data, because we certainly don't want to make anything up. And so again, it's hard, but we do a lot of storytelling behind that. So finding a restaurateur, finding someone who's like willing to say, yeah, we waste this much food and it's been really challenging, or other sort of stories around that. Right now, we're having a garbage issue because of the hurricane situation. So that actually ended up being something good where we could say, if we were dealing with this food waste, our streets wouldn't be stinking of rotting food right now in the heat. So just thinking of like interesting ways to tell the story that maybe aren't with, easily accessible data.
Well, thank you. And thank you both, Elisa and George. Again, we're going to move on. And thank you for the good questions and comments from the attendees. Much appreciated. We're next going to hear from Beth Low-Smith from Kansas City, and then Tali from Boston. So let's proceed with you, Beth, and two people that I believe have done quite the job of mastering the case of how to make the case to your elected officials. Take it away.
All right. Thank you, Mark. So I'm going to chat a little with you about what a good toolbox looks like for an effective intersectional advocacy campaign. And I took a little time to just jot out like some things that I think are really essential for that toolbox. And maybe you'll have questions and we can go into more depth about it. So I think it's really important that an effective advocacy campaign, whether intersectional or not, really it has to start with activities for understanding the needs and the goals and the values of the stakeholders and the decision makers that you need to reach. The most effective advocacy, as probably everybody knows, is rooted in listening to understand rather than listening to persuade or convince somebody that you're right. You really can't identify effective policy goals without listening deeply first. Likewise, persuasive messages reflect real shared values between the decision makers and the impacted stakeholders. And so you've got to have good information and a firm understanding of both of those groups. So anyway, as a result, listening is really essential. And so you got to start with strategies for doing that. I know we have employed many different strategies, some more successfully than the others over the years. We ended up working on an initiative to expand transit access and reduce fares on public transit in Kansas City, Missouri, that ultimately resulted in becoming the first city in the country to make transit free. So there's zero fare transit in Kansas City, Missouri now. We ended up doing that work because we initially were starting to work on implementing the next phase of a grocery store access project. And when we asked stakeholders what they were most interested in, where the barriers were for their community, many of the community neighborhood leaders in food apartheid neighborhoods were pointing to transit and saying transit's a real barrier. And so is specifically transit to grocery stores and other facilities that accept WIC and SNAP. And so we started doing surveys of residents at bus stops and asked them more about what was going on and what their barriers were. And then we worked with various stakeholders to come up with some some potential solutions, and we tested those. More surveys and feedback from stakeholders, from the bus riders, and from other residents in the community who lived in low access, low income communities and didn't have cars. And what we heard was that the cost was a really big barrier. And we had established a relationship with the Area Transportation Authority years earlier because of some concerns residents had raised around the bag limits that had been unevenly enforced on our buses. And we had a good, positive working relationship with them. And we came to them and we said, we're hearing this and we're interested in working with you on some solutions. And they said, essentially, we're hearing it for different reasons. We're hearing that the fares are a barrier, and they're actually a barrier to safety on the buses as well. And we're considering how to work on it. Would you be willing to work with us more? And so we jumped at the chance. And when we started out, we were working on our own policy agenda. And what we ended up getting to work on was multi-sectoral effort to reduce bus fares in the metro. We weren't the only ones making the case for zero fare, but we were the primary ones making the case for the impact that it would have on food security and food access. And so we were able to bring unique expertise, and we were able to talk about the economic benefits in terms of our food system and food security. And so that's what we did. Some other strategies that you might use include hosting community meetings, using just even index cards to collect feedback from stakeholders. Simple things, they don't have to be complex, but it's important that you are trying in every available opportunity to be where the impacted stakeholders are present and to listen to what they want and need. A variety of partners and allies and who are willing to help connect with decision makers and share their own perspectives is really a vital part of any effective campaign. I think it will help you broaden your appeal and also reduces the burden of work, but it will make for more effective messaging if you aren't having to speak for everybody, but rather you're helping ensure others are heard. You want to create opportunities for decision makers and impacted stakeholders to connect directly, especially those who are also constituents. As a former elected official, I can tell you the most important stakeholders are the ones who are also constituents to most elected officials. You can host roundtable discussions. You can have really informal coffees with just a few stakeholders. You can do site visits. They're often a really fun way of engaging elected officials and conversations with the impacted stakeholders so that they can learn firsthand about the challenges that they're facing at urban farms or community gardens or food pantries. And you can always do office visits as well. It's important when you're doing office visits to make sure that folks have the tools for ensuring that everybody who's impacted can participate and speak for themselves. So you want to think about ways to make that simpler and remove barriers. So providing sample testimony or other advocacy templates for folks who can't attend a meeting is a good idea. Providing tools like postcards. I can show you an example right now of that. So we have used a couple of different tools for helping impacted stakeholders tell their story, even if they're not going to be able to attend a particular meeting. We do a photo booth from time to time. So we'll create these posters and folks can complete their poster. We take their picture and we also have them complete a consent form so that we're doing ethical story sharing and we get their permission for the specific intended purpose and their contact information so that we can contact them later on if we need to ask for their permission to use it for a different purpose. We also have tried postcards, I think I mentioned. So this is an example of a postcard. This is the front of it. Strong Farm Bill feeds us all. And then the back is very simple. It's just an I care statement, and then folks can share why they care about various aspects of the Farm Bill. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what I'm talking about when I say postcards and photo booths. You can also do things like making sure that financial concerns aren't a barrier to participation. So you'll want to offer to pay folks for their time and their expertise, and provide funding for things like travel expenses, parking. Maybe they need a ride. You want to make sure that those sorts of practical concerns are not a barrier for participation for those who are impacted. Finally, you want to ensure that that you have something to leave behind with decision makers when you're trying to persuade them. And many times a campaign will start with, early on, we'll have a big report. And those reports are fantastic. They help us learn a lot as advocates that we need to know. But I want you to all hear me when I tell you, elected officials are bombarded with materials. They don't have time to read everything. It isn't that they don't care, it's that they really don't have time. And so it's vitally important that you don't just leave them with a 10 or 20 or 40 page document. You need to provide them with one page that illustrates the story that you're trying to share visually, as well as with some very basic information about the problem and the proposed solution, without over-relying on data. So don't make 50 bullets with a separate data point cited for that's. You can have that information on hand if they ask for follow-up. It's always a good idea to have done your homework, but don't overwhelm them with it to begin with. Start with something very simple. You can share pictures. You can share pictures, scanned copies of photo booth posters, or you can provide them with postcards and then like a summary of the, half pager that has a summary of the bill that you want them to file, or examples from other places, and promise to share additional information if they have questions. I think I've gone a little over time, so I'm going to stop talking, and hopefully others will lead the way. Oh, you're muted, Mark.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Beth. And now we're going to hear from Tali Robbins from Boston.
Great, thank you so much. And my name is Tali. I'm the policy director in the office of City Councilor Michelle Wu in Boston. So I'll come at this from a little bit of a different angle. I have a background in advocacy, but I now work in an office of an elected official who doesn't really need to be convinced of the importance of food system issues. So I'll talk a little bit about how she came to that point, some of the food system and food policy reform efforts that she has led on, and kind of what we've learned about both working with community advocates and also using her position as an elected official to make the case to other elected officials and to other city agencies to drive forward implementation work. So my boss, Michelle Wu, she, before attending law school, she actually opened a little tea shop with her family. And she talks often about how the kind of red tape and bureaucracy that she experienced when trying to get this cafe off the ground was one of the things that motivated her to go into public service in the first place. She was very frustrated that kind of without existing relationships with local elected officials, she, coming from a first generation family without a whole lot of family capital or other family resources to draw on, had a really hard time getting this restaurant off the ground. So when she started working in public service, first for former Mayor Menino in Boston, one of the first things she worked on was a restaurant roadmap, kind of outlining the notoriously complex permitting and licensing system that we have here in Boston for small businesses, and particularly for restaurants to open. She also worked on launching the city's first food truck program, which is now expanded across the city. when she was elected to city council in 2013, took office in 2014. One of the first things she worked on was sort of drawing on this background as a small business owner to make sure we were thinking about racial equity in city contracting, knowing that city contracts are one of the primary tools for wealth building in Black and brown communities in Boston. She partnered with then City Councilor Ayanna Pressley to pass an ordinance requiring regular reports on the breakdown of the racial and demographic breakdown of what contracts the city was issuing. It's been a long time coming, and the implementation of that ordinance has sort of been slow, but we are now getting regular reports from the city. Just earlier this year, we found out that over the last 5-year period, it was just over $2 billion that the city spent in public contracts. Only 1.2% of that money went to businesses owned by Black and Latinx entrepreneurs. So it's a shamefully low percentage. There's a huge opportunity to ramp up efforts to make city contracting more accessible to minority-owned, women-owned, and locally owned businesses. So she's had a long record on this sort of equity and city contracting piece. And I say all that as kind of the foundation to say that when food system advocates approached her and asked her to start working on a good food purchasing program ordinance for the city of Boston, she had a long record in working in city procurement. So that was not sort of the power of local procurement was not a hard sell for her. For those of you who might not be familiar with the Good Food Purchasing Program, this is a set of procurement standards that was first adopted by LA Unified School District. Boston, under the leadership of my boss, Michelle, was the first city on the East Coast to pass such an ordinance in 2019. Sets out a set of standards around nutrition, a valued workforce, local economy, so local procurement, animal welfare, and environmental sustainability for all publicly, all food purchased with city dollars. In Boston, that primarily applies to Boston Public Schools, which spends $18 million a year on food. Also a couple of other city agencies, which spend cumulatively about $4 million. So Boston Public Schools is by far the main purchaser. Those 5 kind of value categories that are built into the Good Food Purchasing Program, Michelle worked with a broad coalition of racial justice advocates in Boston to add a 6th category to that pre-existing ordinance on racial equity. So we want to make sure that as we're selecting and measuring progress along a predetermined list of metrics in nutrition, environmental sustainability, et cetera, we're also incorporating that set of standards for equitable city contracting and city procurement, so that through our purchasing of food for Boston Public School students, we can make sure that we're investing some of that money in locally owned and Black and Latinx owned food businesses right here in Boston. There's plenty of examples of catering companies and other food companies in Boston that have the capacity to provide nutritious and culturally relevant food to Boston Public Schools, and we're just currently not tapping into that opportunity. And it's that disparity in city contracting is a huge driver of Boston's racial wealth gap. So I guess I'll just say, so where we are with the Good Food Purchasing Ordinance right now, it passed pretty quickly, again, because there was sort of this body of work on equity and city contracting on the city council. City council was pretty familiar with the potential of procurement to drive broader change in our supply chains. So this was a matter of just adapting that and tailoring the message specifically to food system advocates.
Cool.
And getting sort of
I can't use Miles for this.
Getting sort of a broader set of food activists and food system experts involved in the process, as well as Boston Public Schools students and teachers and parents who were sort of a critical part of this coalition. So it was passed pretty quickly in 2019. The implementation has been slow, in part because of COVID. Our school nutrition staff has obviously been sort of working in crisis mode for a year and a half now. So that's certainly delayed things. We are now seeing progress, which is really exciting. We have a contract signed with the Center for Good Food Purchasing to conduct that sort of baseline assessment that'll then lay out the roadmap for moving forward. I think one of the big lessons we've learned, though, is similar to Michelle Wu's work on equity and city contracting overall, ignoring, beyond just the food system. There's no one in city government who sort of oversees procurement overall. Every city department does its own procurement work, which means it's really hard to implement broad strategies to shift procurement in a given direction. We've seen progress just very recently over the last couple of months. The city has hired a chief, I think the title is Chief Strategic Procurement Officer, to be able to guide that purchasing work over all city departments and agencies. Boston Public Schools is one of those. But before that, we sort of saw that the director of food and nutrition services at Boston Public Schools reported to the superintendent, who then reported to the mayor. Every other city agency that purchased food or purchased anything reported in some chain of command to the mayor, and there was no good way to coordinate efforts across departments. So that's been a real roadblock for us, and something we're like actively working on, sort of breaking down silos between city departments to make sure that that coordination can happen moving forward. Another thing I'll say is that we've seen a lot of progress from some of the anchor institutions in Boston. Boston obviously is home to a lot of universities and hospitals, some of which have done really exciting work on their own to shift their food purchasing in a more sustainable and equitable direction. So I think there's a huge untapped opportunity there as well for City Hall and for the mayor's office to sort of play a convening role in bringing those anchor institutions to the table and saying, what can we do to create shared purchasing platforms or just share best practices, or kind of make sure that all of us as major institutional buyers in the city are pointing in the same direction and are able to leverage those food dollars in a way that builds up local wealth in Black and brown communities in Boston, and then also kind of shifts the food system in a more nutritious, environmentally sustainable and humane direction. So I will stop there. There's lots of other work that I could talk about, but the Good Food Purchasing Program is sort of the big foundational piece of food system legislation that Councilor Wu has passed, and we're really excited to see it keep moving forward.
Thank you, Tali. That was marvelous. Great story. And I do have a question here from equity advocates that I think would be directed at you. If we can get, if they would like to, I don't have a person's name, but I see equity advocates. They'd like to come on board and speak, ask their question. I'd appreciate it. Is that you, Leah?
Hi, yes, I'm Leah Eden. I'm with Equity Advocates, and we are located in New York City. So I appreciate hearing from someone who's sort of, represents a policymaker already on board. And I'm just curious from your perspective, if you have any advice or strategies for advocates to leverage existing champions, right? Like your city council member, if we have someone who is on board and invested in this work, how do we leverage those champions to advocate to their peers, whether it's other city council members or in other positions?
That's such a good question, and I think the answer would change a little bit based on the particular political landscape that you're working in. In our case, I think it's and I think for all elected officials, it is never, I'm going to sound cynical here, but it's never a bad thing to kind of stroke the egos of other elected officials. So if someone has a record on a particular issue, show that this relates to their issue. If someone is really, we have folks in the Boston City Council who have a strong record of education advocacy more broadly, show that this is an issue that matters to the well-being of children and students. I had actually mentioned in the chat privately earlier, we have a colleague on the City Council, Councilor Julia Mejia, who's done amazing work in passing a residential kitchens ordinance, making it possible for people to start shelf-stable food companies from their own homes. So she and her team have done incredible outreach to small-scale food producers in the city. And so kind of tapping into that existing body of work and saying, you have all these relationships already, here's how this work could complement and strengthen and advance the work you've already done. That's been really helpful in kind of getting their buy-in and their partnership. Curious what other folks have to say.
One of the things that I would do is I would ask them who else is ripe for cultivating as a champion. So ask them who else is interested, whose districts they think are being impacted by the issue, especially if it's somebody who you would normally think of as if there's a partisan divide in the community where you're working, it could be really useful to say to them who on the other side of the aisle might be open to having a conversation with me about this or with you, and ask them if they have any tips. I would also think about, this is more relevant maybe at the state level than at the local level, but state legislators often form issue-based caucuses where they examine issues. They have guest speakers. They'll maybe meet weekly or monthly to talk about a particular topic, like food access or food security. So you might ask if that's a thing and figure out whether there's an opportunity for you to do some sort of guided learning with a group of interested elected officials.
Okay, well, thank you. I got a question here from Namita Kopa. I don't know if you're on board or in the queue, but we'd love to hear from you if you like to share.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. My name is Namita. I work with the City of Las Vegas Sustainability Office, and I'm part of the Food Council here in Southern Nevada. And just in tandem, I think this was an excellent follow-up, as you mentioned, kind of stroking egos around issue areas that are of interest to particular elected officials. I'm curious to know if in the group, if there are any examples of like high profile, very visible events that work in tandem with these food strategies. Sometimes I find with our own council members that if we can propose an opportunity for them to get their face out in the public or get their face on a publication or in the newspaper or whatever, we oftentimes will have greater success in pitching a larger strategy. So I'm curious if from the group, if there are any examples of this in other communities. Thank you.
So we started a decade ago organizing a policymaker tour in conjunction with the annual Urban Farms and Gardens tour that's open to the public. And we had this little bus that we would rent, and we'd invite decision makers to come with us on a tour of a few of the locations. And we always made sure that we had lots of photography going on and documenting the event, and we would issue a press release with some of those visuals, and sometimes we got it picked up, but even if that didn't happen, we always had the opportunity to connect the decision makers with the impacted stakeholders, the urban farmers, and we worked to prep those growers to talk about the issues that were impacting them in terms of policy, and actually managed to secure several really great policy changes as a direct result of the conversations that began at those tours.
Would anybody else like to comment on that?
I can add one more just because it ties in really well with the fare free transit advocacy, which I was really excited to hear about all your success in Kansas City. Also something that is an ongoing push in Boston. My boss, when in response to proposed fare hikes to our subway system, organized a standout at so the subway system in Boston is called the T, or the MBTA, but we call it the T. The useful thing about Boston history is that we could call this protest the like new Boston Tea Party. But she organized a coalition of folks across the entire city to stand out at every single T station and pass out leaflets in opposition to the fare hikes. And I think just the breadth across the city, having someone in front of every single T station was catchy for press and definitely drove press attention.
I see we have a hand from Sam.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I just want to pick up on the transit advocacy and continue on that theme for just a second. We in Pittsburgh have been advocating for a low-income fare program for a little while. We've actually looked at the Kansas City model a number of times, so it's good to hear more directly about that. But curious, I guess mostly the question is for you, Beth, but curious kind of what others would say as well in terms of like, you know, we just don't have the political support from our transit agency to support the program right now. So we've been trying to figure out, and it's kind of a similar issue actually with other advocacy that we're doing with City Council and County Council right now, where we don't, we just don't have a lot of political support for kind of the asks that we're putting forward. And so we're trying to figure out how to start to cultivate that. And how to kind of, I don't want to say repair some of the damage that we might have done, but because we didn't have a lot of the support, we were more outspoken, let's say, in our advocacy and critical of the decision makers who then we need to win their support ultimately. So that's something we've been struggling a lot with of how to do the kind of, inside and outside advocacy strategies. So if anyone has any comments on that, would be much appreciated.
I would recommend that you start by figuring out everything that you can about the decision makers involved. So look at what they affirmatively are interested in doing, learn more about that, learn what their backgrounds are, and learn who their allies and allies are on the local government that may have funding authority for the transit authority, and that will help you identify where there are perhaps opportunities for mutual gain. Maybe you can find a way to be helpful and useful to them while also furthering your own interests. And maybe you find that one of their key allies is someone that you have worked with and have a more positive relationship with, or at least have an in with, like somebody on your council knows one of the elected officials that's their ally. So I would start with that and try and lay the groundwork. I would probably try and have a conversation or two directly with some of those decision makers that you need to persuade, where your goal is not to persuade them about anything, it's to learn, and it's just to ask them questions and learn as much about what they're trying to do as you can. Resist the temptation to lead with the persuasion. First, you got to learn more about the situation. And then I would figure out where the other advocates and stakeholders in other sectors are and talk with them, because maybe they have leads and relationships that can help you.
Good, excellent advice. I'd love to get Lainey Sidlowski in here on the conversation. She has a comment that I think it's be worth hearing, and has quite a bit of background, first in Food Policy Council in the District of Columbia, and now I believe in Denver, Colorado. So Lainey, if you'd like to join the conversation, please speak up.
Hi all, I'm Lane. I had just sort of a comment in there around sharing specific data with city council members or with your elected officials and really customizing the data that you share with them. I found that it's really enabled them to feel empowered to talk about these issues and to understand the local needs within their neighborhoods and communities when they go out and talk to their community members, and to feel a little bit more like there is a broader situation at stake for them when we talk about the broader food policy changes that need to occur, or funding changes that need to occur in the community. Whether your city council is sort of a strong city council or a weak structure of city council, having those sort of voices and opportunities for community members to go and advocate to and with them has really been helpful in some of our work, both in Denver and when I was working in Washington, D.C. So I just wanted to share that. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Lane. Thank you. Always good to have your voice here. We have actually this something I haven't really quite heard yet, and I'm going to speak up here for Leah, who spoke earlier. Oh, there you are. You want to ask your question, Leah?
Sure. Hi. Sorry to ask again, but I was saying this has been really helpful in thinking about how to sort of make the case for policy change or specific campaigns. I'm in New York City. We do not have a food policy council here, and there has been a push to create one. We've heard a lot of pushback from policymakers around sort of not wanting to have more bureaucracy or too hard or whatever. And so I'm wondering your sort of advice or thoughts about how to make the case for the actual creation of a food policy council, around benefits for community, but also potentially benefits for policymakers themselves.
And if any of the four of our presenters have a thought on that, that'd be great to hear from you.
I can speak to this a little bit if that's all right. So we were formed through a resolution. So back up a little bit. We are actually a nonprofit. that has a formal relationship with the city. So we have like an informal advisory body. There's like a resolution and it's on the books, if you will. And that, we went back and forth on whether or not we should try to be like placed within the city or be kind of this like quasi, if you will. And we found that this was really helpful. The way we do it, one, because the city doesn't have to give any money. We're grant funded, which is a whole other thing that there's probably 100 sessions on that one. Policymakers both love us because they can say, well, we're working with the Food Policy Council to do these great things, but then also we can push back in a way that's we have a little more freedom to push back and kind of speak our minds a little bit more. So I would encourage you all to think about kind of how do you want to position yourself? And there's lots of models out there. But again, the policymakers, they like us and it's pretty easy for us to get in touch with them because we have this sort of advisory body status, but we also don't necessarily get sucked into all the like city bureaucracy, which I have worked for cities and I understand how that kind of shakes out. So I'm not sure if that's helpful, but we're kind of in this in-between place that I enjoy.
Yeah, I think you make a good point there, Elisa, that, you have to decide, do you want to be officially a part of the city and be a food policy council with that kind of sanction, or do you want the sort of relative independence you may get as a, separate from city government? But George, you have a comment on this, don't you?
I do. I mean, I'm kind of on the other side of that coin of Elisa. So I mean, and it comes with its costs and its benefits, but I think Elisa, you had a good point. I mean, you kind of have to think about what the end outcomes are, right? What do you want the end outcomes to be? Because I think, Elisa, what you all are doing in New Orleans is kind of straddling the line a bit in a good way, right? Because you still have that formal connection with the city. So presumably you have at least priority access or some kind of priority access to funding and things like that. And you have access to policymakers, so on and so forth, but you're not necessarily constrained by the bureaucracy, to your point. Whereas now I am a municipal employee, and it's a little different now that I've switched to the economic development division. But when I was in the mayor's office as the food policy director, you are ingrained within the bureaucracy. So you have, again, the pros of all of that, right? Like, I mean, I had a direct line to the mayor, right? So I could very easily advocate for things. We have kind of a strong mayor format. So when she would put a budget together, and her predecessor, Paul Simon, before her, when they would put a budget together, I mean, unless the councils would really have to hate that thing to take it out of there. So it's like, once it's in there, it's kind of in there. So from a funding perspective, it was really, it was really beneficial, but we definitely didn't have the flexibility and the leeway to move like a 501c3 or a 501c4 in terms of advocacy and things like that. We definitely had to be a little more subdued and a little more careful, right? It was education, it's not advocacy. And so, you have to straddle that line. So it depends really are you all interested in funding? Are you all interested in advocacy? Are you interested in both? And I think that will really, those kinds of thought exercises and planning exercises will really frame out how you think about the route you want to take.
Thank you, George. We got a question. We're getting near the end here, so we're going to getting close to wrapping up. I've got a question here from Ephraim Palmer. Palmero. I'm
yes,
sorry.
Hello. Yes, Palmero.
The O got cut off. Go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is Ephraim Palmero from the Indy Food Council, City of Indianapolis. So I'm kind of on the same boat with George right here. It's very interesting though, because the Indy Food Council, it started with a nonprofit. So it was under a community development corporation, but then later on, a few years later, it was incorporated through ordinance that was passed by the City Council of Indianapolis. So it's kind of interesting, like how all of that developed. But what was important that what was said throughout this whole thing was, just start. You ought to start, and then you guys can think about the particular outcomes, the particular pros and cons that you have, and what the City Council relationship will be for your food council. But I think it's also important as well. I forgot who. Going back to the I think the city of Vegas, Las Vegas, about like high profile events for involving um, policymakers into the arena of the food system. One of the things that we did was we are a current implementing partner of the PHA Good Food for All program, and PHA stands for Partnership of a Healthier America. It's mostly popular due to Michelle Obama being the honorary chair for that organization. But what we do is we are part of a fresh food box distribution for 12 weeks. And out of those 12 weeks, we asked the mayor of Indianapolis, because one of the pros for us now being under the city is we had the direct line, was asking the mayor of Indianapolis, hey, we understand that you have a interest now on what the food system is looking like for Indy. Why don't you participate in one of our food box distributions with PHA? And the mayor for one this week said, yes, he would. He joined and had a great time. And now he's a lot more interested in what, not just what the Food Council work is doing, but what is the state of the food system. And that's just one of the things that you guys have to balance it out and figure out. But yeah, just start, then look at what your governance structure is. But also like what we're also working on is developing like an independent advisory commission. So we also do have that sort of interesting structure that ties in the city council government, but also an independent body that oversees some of our commission stuff. So yes, food for thought.
Thank you, Ephraim. That's excellent contribution. I got a great question here from Gigi Owens. Gigi Owens, you'd like to enter the conversation? We're just so everyone knows, we're going to kind of go right up until the end here. We know you all want to hang out and kibitz for a while and gossip, but there'll be plenty of time to do that. But it seems like we got some good questions still in the queue, and there's a huge amount of good information and resources in the chat box. So, if anybody still has some questions or wants some idea on how to get a little additional assistance, make sure you check that out. But Gigi, are you available to share your comment?
Yeah, thank you so much. There's been so many good resources, and so I just really would love to insert this. I'm in Tucson, Arizona, and I feel like we have a new mayor and city council as of last year, and they've been doing a lot of really good work about establishing a climate action plan and looking at other kinds of like equity studies and fair housing and looking at zero waste initiatives and things. And I see food as like all parts of these other kinds of initiatives, but I never see them coming up in these discussions, and I'm not totally sure why. But I was just wondering if that's something any of you had come across, and if there's, is it better to kind of like make a food system plan and have that as well as these other ones, or is it better to kind of look at some of these initiatives that are already happening and see if and how food can go into those, as well as kind of like making some kind of strategic food plan as well?
I think it's a really good question. I'd love to hear from our panelists if you have any thoughts on that. I hear this kind of question all the time from food policy or groups that are interested in forming a council. I mean, how do you make food part of the conversation? I mean, some places around the country, that's been pretty easy to do, but in other parts of the country, it's not. So anyone have any thoughts on how you get that conversation going?
Something we've been doing the last, year or two is working on drawing attention to the ways that the types of problems you've mentioned particularly impact food workers and food security. So last year we worked on a ballot initiative led by many other groups. We were very minor players, but there was a ballot initiative in Missouri to expand Medicaid, and we talked about the particularly important impact that had on the physical and financial well-being of food workers. And we invited food workers who were involved in the ballot initiative effort to come and speak to the coalition about the event. We also did some communications about why Medicaid expansion was vital to an equitable and equitable food system. So you might think about talking about going to these hearings and making a case for the impact that that high housing costs have on food security, and the value of the proposed solutions, if there are any, for addressing community food security.
Elisa, do you want to comment?
Sure. Yeah, I was just typing furiously to put it in the chat, but we do both. So if there's an issue that we know food hasn't really been like thought of, we'll show up to those meetings, or we'll show up to the council meeting where they're discussing that, and we will just keep talking about food. And so after a while, they're like, we get it. Y'all are food people. And we come with data, always come with data and best practices. So it's not just like, hey, I think food's important. It's like, I think food's important. Here's why. Here's some solutions. And that sort of gets us in the door. And from there, then we, reach out, maybe try to get a meeting or something to show that, you need to do food kind of separately, but we do both, basically any way, by any means necessary, if you will.
Thank you. You made a really good point there. I've been getting a lot of questions here from Elisa Duncan. Has a lot of good comments and thoughts. Would you like to join for a minute? And you just had a good one on in response to Gigi. No? Maybe you can comment a little bit later. Anyone else want to raise your hand? Get in. We got like a minute left, but we would love to hear your thoughts if you have anything else. Here we got one from Namita.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to plug, I am based out of Las Vegas, and our food system challenges here in the desert Southwest are maybe different from other locations that have greater proximity to water. And so my personal experience here has been, put in food wherever you can, because even if food is available to you in your immediate vicinity and you can solve those food supply issues where you are, there may be a need to look at the larger picture of where agriculture grows, how food is brought to you via transportation, and also include food access, hunger, and homelessness related issues where you are. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation. Thank you.
Good advice. And with that, I think we are going to have, no, you think you're done. Okay, I think we're going to have to call it quits, folks, because this has been really phenomenal. I want to thank you all. Great questions, comments. Again, look at all the information that's being generated here. I think you're going to get a lot of answers to your questions. I really want to thank Elisa, George, Beth, and Tali so much for your taking the time to be with us. I also want to thank you for the good work you're doing. I mean, it's always great to have you come and share it and we show our appreciation for what you have to say. But I know that between you had years of work that you've been putting into this, and I've followed some of you for quite a while, and it's really phenomenal how much energy you've put into this, how smart you've become, and you're really leading the way. And it's extraordinary to get the kind of help that you have. But I hope your communities are grateful for what you do.